Hey, welcome to Agnes Thompson's channel. My name's Martha, and I'm going to share my story with you.
My children called me obsessed. "Mom, come on, it's just paper," my son, Mark, would say with that condescending tone he'd perfected over the years. I'd heard it ever since he, an 18-year-old boy, went off to a prestigious university and returned 4 years later as a man, convinced that the world was divided into efficient and outdated. I, with my notebooks and folders, clearly fell into the latter category. My daughter, Jennifer, 2 years younger than Mark, would simply roll her eyes, never looking up from her sleek, impossibly thin phone, as if a whole world existed inside it that was far more fascinating than my life in my small house. They were 45 and 42 respectively, successful, busy, and, it seemed to me, completely lost in the digital noise, in a perpetual search for novelty and instant gratification. Their lives were a relentless sprint, while I lived by my own long-established rules. My rules, which they called obsession. I'm 68 years old. My name is Martha, and I live in the same small, cozy, 3-bedroom house in a quiet part of Scottsdale, Arizona, that my husband Richard and I bought many years ago. Outside my window, the sun is always shining. On the windowsill are my beloved cacti, each one grown from a tiny shoot. They were my pride, because to grow them so beautifully required a great deal of patience and care. In the back, my small but meticulously maintained garden was more than just a hobby. It was my way of organizing the world, of turning the chaos of nature into a predictable and beautiful harmony. This is how I approached my life. And my documents. My late husband, Richard, always understood this. He was a design engineer, and he appreciated the logic of my approach. He used to say that my love for order wasn't a weakness, but a superpower that helped us make sound financial decisions, plan our vacations, and ultimately build the life we had. He'd always joke that without my notebooks, we would have drowned in bills and paperwork. After he passed away 6 years ago, these rituals became even more important. They were my anchor, my connection to our shared past, our shared world, which I was trying so hard to preserve. Every month, as soon as the mailman left the bills and statements, I would begin my ritual. It wasn't just reading, it was a deep dive into the details, cross-checking every number, every date. I would sort them into categories, file them in separate folders, each with its own color: green for utility bills, blue for bank statements, yellow for medical. Bills for electricity, receipts from the grocery store, every piece of paper had its place. And, of course, the Medicare statements. Ever since I turned 65 and retired, Medicare had been the cornerstone of my financial security. And, because of that, it was my main project. I read all the booklets and all the updates as if they were a captivating book. I kept my own notebook, my master journal, where I manually logged every doctor's visit, every procedure, every payment. It was my personal, analog version of the cloud, and I trusted it more than any digital service. Jennifer, who came over one day to help me with cleaning out the garage, stumbled upon my folders, neatly arranged in a cabinet. She picked one up, labeled Medical Expenses 2024, and after carelessly flipping through a few pages, she laughed. "Mom, seriously? Why do you need to keep all this paper? Everything is online. All the information is in the cloud. You can just find everything on the website." I tried to explain that paper copies were my insurance, that a website could be hacked, that information could be changed. But she wasn't listening. "It's just paranoia, Mom. Why spend so much time on it? You're retired, relax. Go to Vegas, play golf, meet up with friends." I felt that she wasn't just teasing me. She genuinely didn't understand. Her world was a world of instant access and fast information. She saw no value in patience, in meticulousness, in the effort you put into the details. She only saw me as a reflection of outdated methods. It was this feeling, this deep disappointment that my most valuable skill was so unappreciated, that led me to notice a tiny detail that anyone else would have missed. It was a cold but sunny day in mid-January 2025. I was sitting at my desk in my favorite armchair, sipping hot tea and cross-checking my Medicare statements against the entries in my notebook. My eyes scanned the lines until they landed on one that caused a slight, but unpleasant, dissonance. Service: Preventive Cardiology Screening. Date: January 12, 2025. Amount: $550. I frowned. I had been to the cardiologist that day, and I was sure I remembered that Medicare covered 100% of preventive screenings and no copay was required. I went to my cabinet, took out the thick blue guidebook they send out every year, and started flipping through it. I found the right page. Everything was correct. The preventive screening I had received was on the list of services completely covered by the insurance. No $550. What was this? A mistake on the statement? Or was I just wrong? At first, I dismissed the thought. Well, a system glitch. I decided I would just call Medicare and clarify. I called, but after 40 minutes on hold, listening to the same monotonous jingle and endless messages about high call volumes, I couldn't get a hold of a representative. I hung up the phone, feeling a slight but growing irritation. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disrespect for my time, for my life. And it was yet another confirmation that the system I relied on was not as perfect as it claimed to be. I called Jennifer and Mark. Jennifer answered immediately, but she spoke quickly, as if she only had a few seconds to listen to me. Mom, come on, that's nonsense. Are you sure you didn't mix something up? Just call them tomorrow, or, you know what, I can help. I'll come over this weekend, and we'll do it all online, without your notebooks. She wasn't just offering to help, she was offering to get rid of my problem, my love for order. I could feel that she wasn't even listening to the core of the issue. She just wanted me to stop being that mom who took up her precious time. Mark didn't answer at all. I left him a voicemail, but he only called me back 2 days later, and his words were even more infuriating. Mom, don't get so worked up. It's just $550. What's the big deal? Maybe it's a new tax? Don't waste your energy on this. You need to relax, maybe buy yourself something nice with that money. I felt alone again. My children, whom I loved so much, didn't see me as a person capable of anything more than just sitting at home and tending to my cacti. They saw me as an aging woman who was worked up over $550, which to them was nothing. But for me, this wasn't about the money. This was about a principle. About order. About the fact that if something doesn't add up, it needs to be fixed. And this sense of justice, deeply ingrained in me over the years, wouldn't let me rest. I decided I would figure this out myself. Without their help. And without their condescending advice. This was my challenge, and I was ready to accept it. I couldn't let go of the thought of that $550. That small number, like a grain of sand in my eye, wouldn't give me any peace, forcing my mind to return to it again and again. It was like an invisible flaw on a perfect tapestry that I had worked so long and so hard to create, and my perfectionist soul couldn't ignore it. I wasn't just looking for a mistake, I was looking for the truth. My life experience had taught me that the little things matter. That big problems often start with small, unnoticed details. This was one of those life rules I'd learned from decades of managing a household, a budget, raising children, and, in the end, taking care of myself. And I decided to begin my own methodical search, just as I approached everything else in my life. I felt like an old detective assigned to the most important case of her career. This wasn't just a matter of justice, but of my own self-worth, which, it seemed, no one but me acknowledged. This was my battlefield, and my weapons weren't strength or speed, but patience, memory, and good old-fashioned logic. My first attempt, the call to Medicare, had been a complete failure. After 40 minutes on hold, listening to the same monotonous jingle that had drilled into my brain, and endless messages about high call volumes, I hung up the phone, feeling a cold irritation building inside me. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disrespect for my time, for my life. And it was yet another confirmation that the system I relied on wasn't as perfect as it claimed to be. It was impersonal, cold, and indifferent, just like my children's words. I began my own audit. My study, which Mark had once called the Museum of the Past, became my command center. I pulled out all my old Medicare statements. Folder by folder, year by year, I carefully laid them out on the desk, like cards for a reading. I cross-checked the entries in my notebook, my master journal, where every doctor's visit, every procedure, and every payment was recorded with almost clinical precision against the official statements. I looked for patterns, inconsistencies, any kind of lead. I knew Mark and Jennifer would have called this madness, but I believed that numbers don't lie. First, I looked at other cardiology-related services. I found 2 more statements from the previous year, where small sums had been deducted for additional consultations, which, I remembered, should also have been fully covered. The individual amounts were insignificant, $30, $45. But together, they began to add up to something bigger. It was like assembling the pieces of a mosaic that suddenly stopped being a chaotic collection of colors and began to take shape. And I did not like the shape I was seeing. I called my cardiologist, Dr. Harrison. I managed to speak with his secretary, Mrs. Evelyn, whom I had known for many years. She was an older, wise woman who, unlike my children, understood the importance of details. I cautiously asked her about the recent changes in their billing system. She explained with sympathy that many clinics, especially those working with elderly patients, were facing enormous pressure from insurance companies and Medicare. She said that many clinics were forced to hire expensive consulting firms to help them navigate the maze of rules and codes. And that sometimes, despite all their efforts, mistakes happen. But I sensed something in her voice that went beyond ordinary mistakes. I felt fear. She wasn't speaking openly, but I understood she was afraid. Afraid of her superiors, afraid of the consequences. And this only strengthened my suspicion. My next thought was, what if this isn't just a mistake? What if it's something more systemic? The thought, like a cold wind, ran down my spine. In that moment, I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I needed a team. And I knew exactly where to find it. I thought of my bridge club friends Esther and Susan. Esther, a former tax consultant with a sharp mind and an incredible eye for numbers, and Susan, a former teacher with a phenomenal memory for details and faces. They were my team, my network. We had known each other for decades, had been through so much together: weddings, funerals, the birth of grandchildren. Our friendship was built on trust, mutual respect, and, most importantly, a shared life experience. We understood each other without words, with a glance, and I knew they were the only ones who would listen without judgment. I called them both and told them about my discovery. At first, they were also skeptical. "Martha, are you really saying you think they're brazenly cheating people?" Esther asked, her voice sounding as if she was trying to convince herself, not me. But my persistence, my methodical approach, my master journal, convinced her. As a former professional, she couldn't ignore the evidence I had provided. For her, just like for me, this wasn't just about money. It was about a principle. The principle that you can't let anyone cheat you, especially when you've worked your entire life to save enough to live comfortably in retirement. We started working together, using my living room as our headquarters. Esther began researching the legal side of the issue. She sat at my old oak table, hunched over her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She found several similar cases where Medicare was accused of fraud, but they were all related to major, systemic failures, not individual clinics. Susan, with her incredible memory, began calling her acquaintances, other seniors who were also Dr. Harrison's patients. The results of her calls were shocking. Almost everyone she spoke to had similar small, but suspicious charges. The amounts varied, but the essence was the same: services that should have been fully covered were only partially paid for, and none of them had even noticed. "This isn't a coincidence, Martha," Esther said when we met at my house to discuss our findings. "This is a scheme. A very clever one. It's based on the assumption that people won't check the small details. They'll just assume it's a small copay. They won't waste their time and energy to fight with Medicare. And that's exactly what they're banking on." I felt a cold fury rising within me. This wasn't just fraud. It was contempt for older people. Contempt for their time, for their money, for their lives. They saw us as easy prey, weak, and foolish. And that was the most terrifying part of it all. I tried to talk to Mark and Jennifer one more time. I gathered all my evidence, printed out all the statements, and prepared a report. I was sure that this time, they would listen. But they were busy. Mark had an urgent project at work, and Jennifer was planning a vacation. When I finally got through to them, they told me once again that I needed to relax and that everything would work itself out. Their indifference was worse than contempt. It was like a bucket of ice water that finally pushed me away from them for good. I realized that in this fight, I was alone. I decided it was time to take more decisive action. I couldn't allow these people, whoever they were, to so brazenly cheat me and my friends. I found information online about how to file a complaint with the Medicare Fraud Task Force. It was a complex, convoluted process, and I knew it would take a lot of time and effort. But I was ready. I took my old, dog-eared notebook, my folders of statements, and began to draft the official complaint. This was the most important project of my life. I wasn't just fighting for $550. I was fighting for justice, for respect, for my voice to be heard. But what she learned and did next turned all expectations upside down. You won't believe how it ended. My call to the Medicare Fraud Task Force didn't lead to an immediate result. The person on the other end of the line, polite but tired, told me that they receive thousands of complaints and that an investigation could take months, or even longer if there wasn't enough evidence. His voice was filled with routine, and I felt that to him, I was just another number on an endless list. He nodded sympathetically at my words, which I delivered with such passion and detail, but I saw indifference in his eyes, as if he had seen all this 100 times before. He promised they would look into my case, but gave no guarantees. Just send all the documents, Mrs. Martha, and wait for a call. We'll be sure to get in touch with you, he said, and I knew it wasn't the end of a conversation, but the end of hope. I hung up feeling deflated. It seemed I had hit the very wall my children knew so well, the indifference of the system. It felt like trying to break through a concrete wall with my head. The pain wasn't physical, but deeply personal. I had invested so much energy, so much time, so much hope into this matter, and it seemed to be dissolving in bureaucratic quicksand. For a moment, I felt old and helpless, just as my children imagined me to be. I wanted to give up, to forget about the $550, about my friends, about that small but important battle I had started. But I was Martha, and I wouldn't give up. Richard, my husband, had always said I was the most stubborn person he knew, and that it was my greatest quality. And now, in this moment, I felt his words like a blessing. I had a plan, one that I felt was the only correct one. I needed to find something that would force this bureaucratic machine to pay attention. Something that would be more important than thousands of other complaints. I used my main resource, time and persistence. I kept digging, but now in a different direction. Esther, using her old connections, found information that Dr. Harrison's clinic, where I had been a patient for many years, had recently changed ownership. The new owner was a large investment firm that, it turned out, had invested in several other medical centers throughout Arizona. All of them, like Harrison's clinic, specialized in working with seniors. The name of the company was Evergreen Capital. The name meant nothing to me, but I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a mistake at one clinic. This was a large-scale, systemic scheme, and I, a small woman from Scottsdale, was on the verge of uncovering it. I decided it was time to involve my children, but in a different, more subtle way. I knew they were experienced, intelligent people, but they couldn't see the big picture. Their world was one of numbers and deals, and I knew I had to speak to them in their language. I called Mark and told him I needed to talk to him and Jennifer. I didn't tell them what it was about, so as not to give them a reason to decline. I simply said it was very important and had to do with our family's inheritance. It was the only hook I knew they would take. I was ready for their criticism, their mockery, their condescending tone. But I was also confident that the truth I would show them would be stronger than their prejudices. Jennifer and Mark arrived on Saturday morning, right on schedule, as if for a business meeting. They were dressed in casual but expensive clothes, Mark in a Ralph Lauren polo, Jennifer in designer jeans and a light silk blouse. They brought me a box of donuts from my favorite bakery, their standard way of showing care without getting into details. I invited them into the living room, where a pile of folders lay on my old oak table. Mark immediately frowned, and Jennifer, noticing it, shot him a quick, pleading look. "Mom, what's wrong?" "You're not sick, are you?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation into a familiar, safe channel. I composed myself. I knew I had to speak to them calmly, without emotion, as if I were giving a business report, not trying to connect with my own children. I showed them my master journal. I showed them how meticulously I kept records, how carefully I tracked every dollar. "You always called this an obsession," I said, and there was no bitterness in my voice, only a statement of fact. "You said it was a waste of time." I showed them the folders they had once called junk. And then I showed them the printouts from the Medicare Fraud Task Force, where all the suspicious charges were highlighted. Their faces, which had been full of condescension, began to change. Jennifer, always the more emotional one, snatched a printout and started to read it. Her eyes quickly darted across the lines, and I could see her trying to put the numbers together. Mark, more reserved, just sat there, looking at me, and for the first time in a long time, he saw not just his mother, but a woman who knew what she was doing. "Mom, I don't know what to say," Jennifer finally whispered, her voice trembling. We thought you were just paranoid." "And I did too," Mark added, his words quiet, full of a dawning realization. "We got so used to everything being a click away that we forgot that not everything is that simple. We forgot that sometimes you just have to take the time to dig into the details." Then I told them about the most terrifying part, something they never suspected. I told them about the trust fund their father, my late husband, had set up for them many years ago. This fund was meant for their future children, for their education and development. But this fund was tied to one of the very investment firms that, it turned out, owned Dr. Harrison's clinic, Evergreen Capital. I, as the sole trustee of the fund, had long noticed strange administrative fees being debited from it each month. But thanks to my meticulousness, I had been tracking them. I showed them the documents that proved these fees were part of the same fraudulent scheme. My children's faces turned pale. They understood that the Medicare fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. The real goal was to get to their family inheritance. Without my careful records, without my obsession that they had mocked for so long, they would have lost everything. The trust fund their father had created for them with such love would have been completely drained. And they wouldn't have even known about it. At that moment, something changed. Mark and Jennifer looked at me not as an aging woman, but as their savior. They saw in me not just a mother, but the same Martha who had always been one step ahead. They saw the wisdom, patience, and strength they had so long ignored. They apologized to me. And I, with tears in my eyes, realized that their recognition was the most important thing I could have received. With their help, we gathered all the evidence. Mark, as a lawyer, helped me draft the official complaint. He translated my master journal and Susan's notes into legal language, turning my suspicions into irrefutable facts. Jennifer, using her social media skills, began collecting information from other patients. She created a private group where people could share their stories, and every day more and more people who had faced similar fraud joined. It was a wave of outrage that was impossible to stop. Our joint effort was like a symphony, where my meticulousness and their professional knowledge created the perfect document. We worked for days and nights. My living room was transformed into a real headquarters, where piles of paper coexisted with laptops and tablets. My children, who had once considered my obsession a flaw, now saw it as their salvation. They no longer looked down on me. They no longer saw me as an aging woman, but as a wise and experienced person who was able to see what they, in their fast-paced world, had missed. Finally, we were ready. We gathered all the evidence, my statements, Mark's legal notes, the testimonies of dozens of people collected by Jennifer. It was a massive, undeniable case. We sent it to the Medicare Fraud Task Force, and this time, they responded. A week later, the same tired employee called me, and his voice was completely different. There was urgency and genuine interest. He told me that our case was the largest and most detailed fraud case against Medicare they had ever seen. He thanked me, my friends, and my children for our work. Our joint effort, based on my old wisdom and their modern skills, led to the Medicare Fraud Task Force taking us seriously. The investigation, which should have taken months, was accelerated and the perpetrators were exposed. Of course, it wasn't a Hollywood happy ending. We didn't become superheroes, and I didn't get $1 million for the exposé. But the fraudulent scheme was dismantled, and their inheritance was saved. Most importantly, I got my family back. My children, who once called me obsessed, now called me the Medicare Maze Master. They started listening to me again, coming over just to talk, not just to help out. I became for them not just a mother, but a source of wisdom, strength, and love. And in that, I realized, lay my true legacy. The fact that I, a 68-year-old woman from Arizona, through my persistence and attention to detail, saved not only our money, but our family as well.